GSM presents. From Keller Hall on the campus of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, the Geological Society of Minnesota is proud to present Dr. Carrie Jennings and Groundwater Governance in the Great Lakes States, from Well-Cobbled to Equitable and Sustainable. Dr. Carrie Jennings has been Research and Policy Director at Freshwater since 2016, after having been a field geologist for 24 years. 22 of those with the Minnesota Geological Survey and 2 with the DNR, Division of Lands and Minerals. She also served as the Science Reports Lead for the County Geologic Atlas Program at the DNR for 2 years. She has been adjunct graduate faculty in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the U of M for 30 years. She applies her understanding of glacial geology and landscape evolution to shape policy and technical approaches for managing surface water and groundwater, avoiding hazards, and using resources wisely. Dr. Jennings did field camp work at the University of Alaska, received her BA in geology from Northwestern University, and her MS and PhD in geology from the University of Minnesota. Carrie and her husband live on a 120-acre farm, which is primarily in a permanent conservation easement through the Dakota County Farmland and Natural Areas Program. Livestock is limited to a dozen chickens, a dog, and a couple of cats. She has twice been elected town board supervisor and served on the Planning Commission for Eureka Township. Groundwater is a crucially important but often overlooked resource in the Great Lakes region. As a common pool resource, the region's aquifers should have a well-structured set of governing principles to guide their sustainable and equitable use. We ask, but do they? We assessed hydrogeology knowledge, legal structures, and the institutions in 6 Great Lakes states, including the tribes that share their geography. We conclude that the current structure, cobbled together over decades in response to different kinds of stressors and crises, does not adequately provide for a participatory and inclusive groundwater management system. It is not founded in adequate technical knowledge everywhere, and it is not coordinated around local, shared aquifers. Thus, it is not constructed to best connect water users to the region's future prosperity. An incredible resource lies beneath our feet and connects us all. Freshwater, with the support of the Joyce Foundation, is working to bring attention and care to groundwater for our shared prosperity and for generations to come.
So I am a glacial geologist, and I've also studied glaciers, the physics of glaciers, glaciology. I worked with Harvey Thorleifson, who is your next lecturer at the Geological Survey. I was there for 24 years. And then I moved through the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, in mapping jobs there with lands and minerals. And then I was the Science Reports Lead for the Groundwater Atlas, the Part B of the County Atlas series. And was recruited to go to Freshwater. I didn't know what the job title meant. Research and Policy Director was what they told me it was. And I said I'd give them a year. And I've been there now 9 years, and I'm really enjoying the work because it has allowed me at this stage of my career to put all I know about Minnesota into some kind of permanent solution for geologic resources that are shared among the people of the state. But also we're working now even more broadly across the Great Lakes. And I see that as a coherent system because it's glaciated in the same way that Minnesota was. And the bedrock is similar, and so we share many things about our geology, but then also, because of the geology, the settlement pattern, the Native American presence, and just the resources that are here, and the challenges that we face. So this is a policy talk, but it is based on this deep understanding of the geology. The title that we came up with, though, Groundwater Governance Well-Cobbled, was not a favorite title of our funder, who really didn't want it to be punny. She wanted to bring the states and the tribal governments in the region along with her to believe that we do need a better system of governance for this really important shared resource. So what we did for a year and a half was looked at what is the status of knowledge of the groundwater or the hydrogeology of this region, 6 states and 35 tribal nations within that geography from here to Ohio, and what institutions in those states are currently working on groundwater and protecting water or permitting wells, and how that varies across those 6 states and the 35 tribes. And then we made some recommendations for what is a better way of looking at groundwater governance. You can tell by the title, what we found was a patchwork of approaches, different in each jurisdiction, and none of it was really comprehensive and going to protect groundwater in a sustainable way. Taryn Mayer was a co-author of this original presentation. He was a PhD student at the Humphrey School, so I started working with policy people at the Humphrey School who really think about resources. And we had a team that included legal experts at Water 365, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, GLIFWIC is their acronym, and then a watershed in Ohio to help us kind of reach out to people there. And this work was all funded by the Joyce Foundation, which is out of Chicago. You probably hear the Joyce Foundation mentioned on public radio. They fund a lot of really important kind of policy approaches. And they were responsible in part for getting the international agreement that is the Great Lakes Compact. So it's the treaty and agreement that protects the water within the watershed of the Great Lakes. And if you know the Great Lakes watershed very well, it doesn't extend very far from where the lake is today in Minnesota, and same with some of these other states. So they are turning their attention now to this region, the Great Lakes, and how we can advance shared groundwater in addition to this compact that they have for the Great Lakes. So the goals of this project were initially to describe the system of groundwater governance within that region. This happens to be called EPA Region 5. We didn't realize that right off the bat, but it's from here to Ohio. Whoops, backwards. And then assess the adequacy of that understanding to support the sustainable use and sustainable and mindful use of these existing, sustainable use mindful of existing and future challenges. Gotta get something to turn off here. Blocking my screen. And then this was going to be a baseline, and we're now in the second phase of work, and we're starting to talk to communities about groundwater governance. So we're going to be able to measure how policy changes going forward. So again, this is the region. And these are the things that we did in our first phase of work. Hydrogeologic knowledge and production, state surveys generally are the ones that are producing this knowledge. The United States Geological Survey also does some work across the region. Current groundwater institutions, by that we mean in Minnesota, we have the Department of Health protecting drinking water. We have the Pollution Control Agency controlling industrial pollutants that might enter the water. The DNR protects water by permitting water wells, high capacity wells especially, that might impact surface water features or interfere with other wells. So we have a distributed system of water governance in Minnesota. Some of the other states are quite different. And then within this geography, you know the states now. These are approximately where the tribal nations are within this geography. So you have tribes across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and there's a little bit of tribal ownership of land in Indiana, and some shared, the diagonal lines are treaty-ceded territory. So those are places where the tribes have authority over water quality standards, surface water quality standards, and are meant to be in a shared agreement with the governments there. That, like many things originally stated in these treaties in the late 1800s, is not being honored currently. So we looked closely into that tribal use and regulation and management of groundwater because they've actually been given some special powers more recently in May of this year. We have a full report, which I don't think anybody wants to read. It's over 200 pages. It looks kind of like a textbook, but we do have summaries of each state. And these were mainly derived so that we could deliver them to policymakers in those states so that they understood where they were. So what we did was conducted interviews. We called people up. This was during COVID when we initially started this. We interviewed 67 people, 25 of those 35 tribal nations. We reviewed all the common law, the statutes, administrative rules that existed, and then looked at the current data sets available for the region from the USGS and other researchers. So we looked at a lot of literature, scientific reports, grade literature, and then the Humphrey School people did something I would never have thought of doing, which is link all of these people and their institutions and how they relate to one another. And there's some really complicated diagrams that I'm going to show you that we started calling the hairball diagrams that show that there's no shortage of institutions and there's probably no shortage of unique connections, but organization is maybe lacking. Did you have a question there?
Yes, I noticed that you have tribes included that are not in the watershed. Why is that?
That are not in, well, because we're looking at the states, not just the watershed of the Great Lakes.
Okay.
So that was the effort. The Joyce Foundation wanted to expand beyond the Great Lakes watershed to the entire state. And that is different than how the compact was approached. So I'm going to quickly get to the findings and recommendations because I want to show you that there's work to do at various scales. So here's the geology part. What I have on the left here is a kind of a simplified geologic map of the area where you have the aquifers, the clastic rock, the sandstone, the carbonate aquifers, and kind of the marine colors, blue and green. And then you have that interesting crystalline rock, the granites, greenstone, gneisses in north central Wisconsin, and of course in a lot of Minnesota, very old rocks. This would be the first bedrock unit that you would encounter if you were able to strip off the glacial sediment. But if you look at which of those are water-bearing and which of those provide drinking water of appropriate quality and quantity, then you're reduced to this map. This is a map of the first usable bedrock aquifer. And in many of these cases, you know how the Paleozoic rocks are stacked in the Twin Cities. There's lots of deeper layers. So you can, if your first aquifer is no longer usable, you can drill potentially deeper to find water. But you'll see there's a lot of white spots on this map. And that means there is no groundwater, or at least there's not abundant groundwater in those bedrock units. And you can imagine why that's the case in crystalline rock, because it doesn't have the porosity to hold groundwater. You have to rely on fractures in it to get usable water. And then often the crystalline rock has more things in it that dissolve into the water that make it not suitable for drinking. So we're blessed with this great abundant water source in the southeast part of the state up to the metro. But have you ever wondered why development doesn't get very far west? Well, part of it is water abundance. And we just came back from a meeting in that white spot in northern Wisconsin, northward woods of Wisconsin. We had a 2-day aquifer cluster meeting up there with the people in that region to talk about their water problems. They have the lowest yielding aquifers in the state. This bedrock is in most places buried, to the disdain of bedrock geologists. But I like looking at the glacial sediment. But here's an example from northwest Ohio, where it's just a thin glacial sediment layer. I see 3 units there. I see a light yellow till, a thicker gray till, and then something else down here might be a lake sediment burying that carbonate bedrock. That's a good aquifer there, and it's shallowly buried. It's probably protected. As long as that is extensive and able and accessible to the people in that region, it's probably a useful aquifer. However, in some parts of this region, you have very thick glacial sediment. So we're looking at over 200 meters of glacial sediment burying the bedrock in some places. It's expensive. The deeper you go, the more expensive it is to drill a well, and the more energy it takes to bring that water up. And so most of the people who are looking at the very thick glacial colors in the dark blue, thick glacial sediment layers, are probably going to find something within the glacial section, some sand body within that stack of glacial sediment layers to use as their aquifer. Those are much harder to prospect for, much less extensive, can be sandwiched between clay layers that makes them not recharged very well, and they often contain things that are finely ground and in the glacial till that people don't like to drink, like arsenic and manganese are common constituents in the glacial section in Minnesota at least. So this map on the right just kind of divides up the bedrock and glacial layers by these kind of zones. Might not be a super useful map to you. Some people think that the first sand layer is the most obvious one for drinking. So on the left, you'll see where sands are at the surface. Actually, these are some of our most vulnerable aquifers because they respond very quickly to climate changes. They're usually irrigated agriculture because they get droughty really fast, sandy areas do. And that means they're also irrigated sometimes with chemicals, so the nitrogen and fertilizer goes right into that superficial aquifer. So that's probably not your solution. But you can imagine that since we've been glaciated so many times, dozens of times, we have multiple layers of glacial sediment shown in gray here on this right-hand cross-section. The aquifers are in the other colors. The blue aquifers are vintage water. That means water that doesn't have contaminants from nuclear bomb testing. So they're protected, at least from the surface for now. The green aquifer is mixed. It's recent water mixed with vintage water, and then the red is recent water. So you might find some protected aquifers in the glacial section, but again, these are small, and you're kind of mining the water from them if they're vintage. If they're not being recharged, then you're probably using something that's not being replenished, and you'll use it up. So these come, there's pluses and minuses. So we have to think about what is sustainable in groundwater use.
Real quick, what's the east-west scale on that map?
This is just a little map from in Minnesota. Yeah, good point. There's probably a lot of vertical exaggeration there. Let me just look at that. County State 8, Highway 25, Minnesota 4. That's probably, I don't know, 20 miles. I clipped it from one of the county atlases from Parkview. Yeah. But I mean, these streams in the subsurface are like these. They were the meltwater streams that were carrying sand and water away from the glacier margins. And then they get buried by the next glacier layer, or eroded, partly eroded. It's complicated. They're hard to prospect for. The states across this region are the main providers of groundwater knowledge in this region. They get their funding from a variety of different sources, and some of them don't have much money at all to work with. One of the reasons Minnesota is looked to in the region for being far ahead in thinking about groundwater is that we've had 30 years of steady funding. Vote yes for the constitutional amendment. We have our tax money, the half-cent sales tax that goes towards environmental spending, and we have the lottery dollars that contribute to our understanding of environmental issues. So those are two steady funding sources that these other states don't have. Look at poor Michigan. They hardly have any money to spend, and they had the thickest layer of glacial sediment on top of their bedrock. And their bedrock is mostly oil-bearing and has salt water in it as well. So they really need to understand their glacial geology in order to have sustainable groundwater sources, to even know where it is. Illinois spends a lot of money, but a lot of it is federal funds, and we didn't think that they had a better knowledge production system necessarily. They spent a lot of duplicative money. They had duplicative projects. The tribes get money primarily from the EPA for their groundwater work. They are, a federal level set of organizations. So they are partner with the USGS often and with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the EPA to study groundwater. But their funds have been declining over the years, and they also have project-specific funds that don't let them retain staff for very long. So they have DNRs just like we do, but their DNRs are maybe 12 people or less. Some are much smaller. They might have a municipal water supply person who's also managing the wastewater plant, who's also managing other things on the tribal lands. And so they have a lot of turnover, they don't have many staff, and their funding source is not very good. And yet, they're expected to kind of do all the same things that another government does. When we started thinking about how groundwater was being used, that varies primarily with how much industry and irrigation you have in your state. So irrigated livestock and crops Sand, if you have a lot of sandy areas, you might be using a lot of groundwater, like in Michigan. And Wisconsin, the central sands, irrigated agriculture. Public water supply differs primarily because some states like Illinois take a lot of public water supply for Chicago and its first-ring suburbs from Lake Michigan, even though some of those suburbs lie outside the watershed for the Great Lakes. They're kind of the elephant in the room as far as taking water from the lakes. They have a very significant problem with their western suburbs, far enough away from the lakes to make it too expensive to pipe water from Lake Michigan. And their cone of depression, you know what I mean by cone of depression? When you pump a well really hard, you draw down the water table in a cone shape. We stopped pumping from the Mount Simon aquifer in Minnesota when our cone of depression was like in the tens of feet, maybe 40 feet. We're like, oh no, we better stop. So we made that aquifer off limits. Their cone of depression in the St. Peter sandstone is over 400 feet. Yeah, Illinois. We don't even believe their numbers really because they weren't sure what we were asking and didn't think they had the right data. So take that line with a grain of salt. But we're trying to understand where the groundwater withdrawals are. This is kind of old data, so 2015. You can see that it's mostly suburban areas with cities taking from the lake, and then irrigated agriculture, the sand plains of Minnesota and Wisconsin. And there's a lot of sand that wraps around this part of Lake Michigan, the Indiana, or the Sleeping Bear Dunes and all those dunes over here. But otherwise, you kind of see it in major metropolitan areas. Not a lot of irrigation in Illinois because it tends to be heavier soils. They grow plenty of corn and soybeans, but they don't need to irrigate it. We see expansion of irrigated agriculture, and this is in part because the corn varieties are moving farther north. They're being bred to be shorter season. And we also are seeing just hotter, drier conditions so that agriculture irrigation is expanding. Okay, groundwater institutions. I started to tell you about this. This is Minnesota's groundwater governance system. We have the DNR, ecological impacts of groundwater withdrawal, Department of Health, human health, drinking water, Board of Water and Soil Resources. They're kind of more, they're not quite a state agency, but they act like one, and they are the boots on the ground in the counties, and they're mostly making recommendations to farmers for best practices for soil and surface water management, but they also do a little bit of groundwater work. Pollution Control Agency, I mentioned industrial contaminants. Department of Ag, though, is looking at agricultural contaminants of groundwater. MnDOT, I don't know why they're there, but they have a role in groundwater. We have some coordinating councils that are meant to oversee the work of the agencies, the Environmental Quality Board. We have the Clean Water Council, which brings together legislators and others. And then we have all these other institutions that kind of are at the county level, watershed district level. So there's no shortage of institutions. But the problem is how they all interact and who's keeping them all together and who is also considering clean water. Not all of these kind of look at water once it's already dirty, and all of them look at water as a resource to be used and extracted, with the exception of the DNR. So this is the hairball diagram. This is, for each state, they looked at, after our interviews, they looked at who each person they interviewed said they worked with and how they were connected. And the stronger the line, the stronger the connection. Every state has a different pattern. Don't look at this in detail, just glaze your eyes over and kind of, because we couldn't make sense of it. There's no system that is super organized, and there's often oversight. This makes the tribes look really well connected, but they're connected with EPA. They're connected with the federal level, and we found some very specific examples where, for example, one of the reservations in Minnesota had designated protection area for their only well, their drinking water supply management area. And the county they were in allowed manure spreading from a confined animal feed operation within that zone and within a mile from the tribal boundary. That's because the tribe reports that area to the EPA. Our health department only looks at those protected areas if they're reported to the state. And so there was no cross-reporting of these areas. And then the county was just gonna, and the confined animal feed operation was on one animal unit under the limit, and it was permitted to go forward. We have not solved this problem. So planning processes are really needed within and across cities, counties, states, and these sovereign nations. And we need to recognize that groundwater is important to our prosperity and our well-being, so our economy and our health. And it would be helpful to have some meaningful goals to meet, sustainability goals. The recommendations that have been made by our health department is that goals should be specific and measurable and actionable and also time delimited. There is legislation on the books right now that the commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources should only permit groundwater use if it is sustainable. But they've so far not denied a high capacity well permit. And they also, the staff have said they don't know what that means. When they sit down and get a well interference complaint and start running the math about what kind of groundwater extraction is going to interfere with that next well over, they don't have an actionable way to measure whether that's sustainable. You know, sustainable, what does that mean? We've already drawn down the water table. Are we expecting it to rebound? Are we looking at how sustainable the use is in the face of a changing climate? So they really need something more concrete to base their daily activities on. It's 70 how many degrees today? I don't have to remind you that the temperature is increasing, our frost-free days are increasing. Precipitation, although it's up, it's usually in heavy precipitation events separated by these long dry spells. So that also is doesn't help us understand how groundwater is being recharged. So all of these things are questions. Some examples, I probably didn't need to look back this far, for flash droughts where suddenly we had super dry conditions, but just in parts of the state. In particular, parts that affected the tribal nations disproportionately in the north in 2021. We made recommendations in our first report and are following up on them now that these rules and these agreements need to be operational at the aquifer scale. It would be helpful to have a regional approach across EPA Region 5 or even greater, but it's really the communities that share an aquifer that need to have that conversation about what is the best use for that water. And it might be to sustain the important ecology of the region, the wetlands, the fens, habitats for rare animals, and this is all dependent on groundwater surface water exchange. Land use factors definitely impact how much groundwater recharge is coming in. If you put a big target parking lot covering a major aquifer, you're really changing the way the aquifer is being recharged. So even plants will change the way water moves from the plant to the atmosphere. We learned just last week at Lac du Flambeau, where a meeting was, that they noted that pine trees held more snow and then let it go later in the spring and allowed water to recharge at a different time in the aquifer. And they wondered what it meant to change the forest cover, the specific tree species in the forests. But certainly things like population density and how we plan to grow are important to think about when we're looking at our aquifers, and then these climate change factors with seasonality and intensity of precipitation, temperature, and wind, because evaporation matters as well. So currently our system is just to look at appropriation. how much water are we letting an individual use? But we need to look beyond that and think about if we do allow old water to be taken from the ground, fossil water to be taken from the ground, do we require that it be somehow cleaned up and recharged near the place where it was taken? So to create a sustainable loop. Because currently we don't allow that in Minnesota. We don't allow recharge of the aquifers. There's not a permitting path. There's not a process to do that. Stormwater ponds, kind of, but most of those are designed so that they don't soak in. And then this flux into the aquifers, we're not thinking about recharging. So reusing water as much as we can before discharging it and then recharging the aquifers where possible. We're currently working on a study of this with Dr. Peter Kung, who's in the geology department here, or Earth and Environmental Studies department. I can't call it that, it's too hard. And he's looking at, how would you recharge an aquifer? How physically does that work? And where is the best place to do that? So we have this statutory language that I mentioned before, but it's currently not actionable. I want to discuss a particular example that you might have heard about. Who's heard about the Niagara water bottling plant? Anybody live down there? I drove by it tonight. So this is a case, it's almost a case of a company approaching a city council to make an economic argument for having an industry come into their community, and kind of not talking much about the impact to that community. Niagara water bottling came to Elko New Market, and it was encouraged by a Scott County commissioner or two to approach that community and hook up to the municipal water supply instead of drilling a new well, but go through the existing water treatment plant and water supply there and put water in little bottles to sell at Walmart and other places, ship out of the region, basically. The city, the land use was discussed by the city council and the planning commission, and they said this supports our tax base. They were issuing a conditional use permit, and they were gonna redirect some of their municipal water supply. It was gonna triple the current city's use. This also was not a use that, it was tripling their current use and extending it beyond what they had planned to do in just population growth. So it was more than they had planned to grow. What we rely on in Minnesota is citizen action. So a concerned citizen requested an EAW, actually a little coalition of 4 or 5 people, a dairy farmer, somebody who just lived near where the plant was being proposed, a high school biology teacher, and those were the 3 key people. And they filled out this really complicated document, this environmental assessment worksheet, and they were given, the EQB, Environmental Quality Board, assigned this environmental assessment to the DNR. They said, the DNR, you're the best agency to work on this request for water, and the only thing the DNR really has in its toolbox is to look at whether or not the use would interfere with any surface water feature in the region. And the surface water features that have the most protection are fens, these calcareous discharges of groundwater, and trout streams, which need groundwater to keep at a certain temperature. So they looked at the region and said, we don't see any impacts here for trout streams or fens. And even though it's the headwaters of the Vermilion River, which is a cold water trout stream, and there was a nearby newly designated fen in Murphy-Hanrahan Park and maybe some unidentified fens here, there's no fen management plan for that region yet. I forget why I put that about the Met Council there. Oh, Met Council. So Met Council, it's our state planning group for the 7-county metropolitan area. And they do look at groundwater use. They do look at projected population growth and transportation pathways, and they make recommendations. They do amazing work with groundwater modelers, and they show these projections for what the water levels are gonna look like 20 years from now, 40 years from now, but they're a recommending body. They don't have any authority. And so they are looking at the growing cities. This is in Scott County, and it's right next to Dakota County, and thinking about those areas that share the aquifer. And they even had a planning conversation in that region. And the cities farther north, which included Burnsville, Apple Valley, Lakeville, Chaska, Shakopee, Milwaukee, and Sioux community, they all said, we don't like what Elko New Market is doing. But you know, they want to still grow. They want to add people. Elko New Market is at the very edge of the metropolitan area. So this is just a conversation at this point. These other cities might be impacted by cones of depression. Mostly Lakeville is using a lot of water. And these metropolitan planning groups are voluntary, and Elko New Market doesn't participate in the conversation. So they did, however, require a revised water supply plan for Elko New Market because they were tripling their use. So here's just a little bit of what it looks like, and this is why Elko New Market has said, why are you talking about what we're going to use? Because they're very small in population, and they're not talking about using that much more. They've only exceeded their DNR permitted amount by a little bit. In fact, if you look at this, a lot of the places have just gotten up to their permitted amount or exceeded it. But you can see that the bigger users are these farther northern suburbs in Dakota County and Scott County. I just want to update this a little bit with where this stands now, because the citizen who's been so active in this, who is a paralegal, part-time worker, and she's just been doing all of this on her own, built this timeline of the effort that she put into it. So think to yourself, if you as a citizen would have this kind of time and ability to devote yourself to this 4-year timeline. So this is when the proposal first came to the Economic Development Board. The city applied to Greater Minneapolis looking for a water user, looking for a 30-acre property. Cities pursuing this lead. They approached the city council. They were trying to go with Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and Eau Claire actually decided to have a groundwater ordinance for the whole county and pushed back so hard, the citizens did, that they decided not to pursue Eau Claire anymore, instead focus on Elko New Market. Then there's kind of news coming out. Ryan Companies is the one involved with the construction down there. And it is being constructed, I can say that. So we have another 2 years or 1 year where the citizens are starting to get involved and asking for an environmental assessment worksheet. We started to get involved with the locals there. She made this for an event we had, so she shows whenever we interacted. A lot of public hearings, DNR is involved. We present to the city council. There's forums and rallies and public information gathering. You might have heard of MNWO, Minnesota Well Owners Organization. We ran a well testing clinic down there to try to get the cities to, or the community to understand what was happening. After a lot of pushing, the DNR said, okay, we will do a pump test on this aquifer, basically a stress test, to see if it will support the pumping that Niagara is planning to do. And they later shared the pump test results with me and some others to kind of review and look at. What was happening during the pump test was wells within a 2-mile radius of the city well that was being pumped. They weren't drawn down specifically, a couple went dry, but they had this surge of manganese in their well. And so some homes, all their laundry went black, and the tub water was gray. You might have seen that article in the Minneapolis Star Tribune. One man told me 20 of his chickens died, and he killed the other 2 because they were lonely. And it was just from drinking the water from the hydrant in the yard. And manganese is a neurotoxin to humans as well. The DNR issued the permit anyway. And it was after we were able to pressure the health department, I don't know if that's in here or not. We ran a well clinic here, but we were talking with the health department about whether or not the DNR should be allowed to go forward with this, because sustainable doesn't just mean quantity, it means quality as well. And so if pumping this extra water is going to continue to make manganese a problem, they shouldn't be allowed to go ahead with this. The DNR brought in a USGS expert on manganese in groundwater, and they said, what we're going to do is have the city decide which wells should be in an ongoing monitoring network, and which wells to get baseline data from, and which wells to monitor as Niagara pumps water, so we can tell if there's impacts. And then it will be up to the city to provide alternative sources of drinking water. And they're hoping it's not Niagara water in little bottles. They're suggesting that the city would be providing like reverse osmosis systems. This is looking like it's going to be a $500,000 testing program and resupply of water. And it's unlikely that the city that these township residents already don't trust is going to provide a plan that they're satisfied with. And then just yesterday I learned, I don't have a slide for this one, that the city didn't realize that they're actually going to have to upgrade their drinking water plant to the tune of $16 million to even be able to provide Niagara water bottling with water. So this sounds like a tax burden for the residents who already, many didn't want the plant. So that's just one example, and this is playing out in many areas. So what we really need, if our goal is groundwater governance that sustainably supports the inclusive prosperity and ecological health for all in the region, then we need a better system. A system that is efficient, with clearly defined roles of agencies that have the management authority to do this. Groundwater that's managed at the appropriate scale, with an integrated approach, coordinating between the cities. So this example that we just did in north central Wisconsin, we had Lac de Flambeau, we had Mold Lake Band, we had Keweenaw Bay Indian Community, and we had the Huron Band of Potawatomi, and then we had U.S. Forest Service, because a lot of this land is Chequamegon Nicolet National Forest. We had 4 people from there and 4 people from the USGS Geological Survey. We had 2 counties, conservationists there, Vilas and Pierce County, Wisconsin. We had the Wisconsin DNR, who's the only water authority in Wisconsin. They don't have all this divided stuff like we do, just their DNR. We had their Geological Survey. We had Wisconsin Rural Water, and I can't remember, a couple activist groups, 30 people in one room, all who touch groundwater in some way, meeting for the first time in many cases, meeting their first Native American in many cases, having a conversation about, we don't have much water, how are we going to share this? How important is it to us? What are the current challenges? And how do we move forward? And it might be that the best way to move forward is at this watershed hyperlocal scale with these conversations in the room. So it's probably the role that, this policy needs to be coordinated across these sectors. Information is appropriate to come down from the DNR and the USGS, shared at the appropriate level with these regions, and then they should have adequate professional capacity and training to act on it. So we do need good data that's timely, adequate finances to support that, and a regulatory framework that's actually implemented and enforced. I would say that we have a lot of those pieces in Minnesota, but we have a system that is still fragmented, with agencies afraid to act. Commissioners are sometimes fired by the legislature for political reasons. And then we do need to have this system of management that is transparent, with all the stakeholders involved. We're identifying trade-offs, like if we don't get Niagara, are we allowed to grow this much? Or, we have to make those conversations open. And then we have to evaluate these programs regularly to see if they're being effective and fair. And the risk of the status quo, do you know what a kludge is? An ill-assorted collection of parts assembled to fulfill a particular purpose. And when you get enough kludges built, piled on top of one another, you get a really complicated system that has no clear organizing principle, is exceedingly difficult to understand, and subject to crashes. Some people call this current system of governance kludgeocracy. So, our current work is focused in these. These were our 4 aquifer action clusters that we had these extensive conversations with the goal of this sustainable groundwater system. I think I'll end there because I've been going on quite a while. So he had a question during the break about, there was an effort called Water Train to ship water from Dakota County or Randolph, put it on a train and take it to Arizona or someplace.
Yeah.
You remember that proposal? That one, there was unified opposition to that at the legislature. Both parties said this is a bad idea. It was the Mount Simon aquifer that company was going after, and the DNR could easily say no to that because the Mount Simon aquifer has special protection. Some of us think that was a test, that Water Train coalition of a rail company and some others were seeing how the system responded, and they could go for the Jordan or the Prairie du Chien, which don't have special protection. They're higher up in the stack of Paleozoic rocks. So we have no way to say no to that interstate transfer of water. And we bring in water from other places, by the way. And there's a new proposal to bring in water from North Dakota into the Red River Valley. Yeah.
What would it take to protect those other aquifers?
I think it would be challenging in the current, for interstate commerce, it would be challenging based on that. But I think if you could show that a region had a groundwater plan and needed that water and was using it responsibly, sustainably, and then you might have some state ability to keep another entity from using it. But it's hypothetical, I don't know. Yeah.
If they were able to take water from here and then truck it out west, couldn't we just run out west and then say we want that water back?
I suppose,
Bring it six.
yeah, they could all evaporate down there. Yeah, and you know, like I say, we already do interstate transport of water into Minnesota, so it's hard for us to say we should let water go out.
So there's, in water rules, there's eastern water rules and western water rules. Can
Yes.
you start running into this concept, and maybe you could review that a little bit and tell people what that's all about?
I wish I had the slide that our legal team just presented last week. Western water law is whoever gets there first has the right to that water. That starts west of us. We don't have that. We have a reasonable use statute, a reasonable use kind of law, and that allowed Minnesota to develop a priority of uses. So domestic water use is of the highest priority. Farther down on the chain are energy production, agricultural use, industrial use. So those do snowmaking, those fall lower on the, on the ladder of priorities. Some people think that's why Niagara water bottling went through the city water supply for Elkin Market, because it would be harder to turn that off. I don't think that flies. DNR said that wouldn't fly, but we don't do Western water law. We have this reasonable use statute, and it's a patchwork of ways of states in the East to look at water. Most of them, though, do say this is a common pool resource, and it should be managed for the good of the consortium of people using it. But they just don't have a very systematic approach to involving those people in the conversation. Yeah.
There's no international group that does groundwater. Is there? I mean, there's a stake in this too.
Yeah, and there is no international group, and there's only a couple of international treaties between US and Canada that deal with surface water. Great Lakes Compact is one. St. Mary's River out in Montana has another one, about as old, from the late 1800s. There might be one other international compact around surface water. But groundwater is usually considered differently by the courts. It's not seen as connected to surface water. It's in Minnesota, it's not a water of the state, so there's no way to kind of regulate it as this resource. So that might be an approach for groundwater, surface water connections to be recognized. This is one of the reasons we're leaning into the authority of the tribes, because they have, as of May this year, They ceded a lot of land to the US. That means they retained the right to use it. I'm gonna just go back to the ceded territory map. They retained a lot of rights on that land to hunt, fish, gather, travel. It's not like they gave it to us or we took it away from them. It's still theirs to use. So the EPA recently gave them authority of the water quality standards over all of that ceded territory. So if the states are not supporting their abilities to hunt, fish, gather, travel with their current water quality standards, the tribes can request new standards be established. So that's a surface water standard, but we're trying to explore how to exploit that to protect groundwater, because groundwater, surface water are connected. Groundwater is cold, groundwater supports trout fisheries and wild rice. Looks like it's important for healthy wild rice stands. And there are places where you might not want groundwater coming out of the ground and hitting a surface water body, like when Line 3 went in and they breached some shallow aquifers and it started leaking into the surface. So we had a conversation with the EPA about those 3 specific cases of groundwater, surface water interaction, and if this new rule could be used for that. And they basically said, go for it, try it, see. I mean, it's probably all gonna end up in the courts anyway, but the tribes right now in Wisconsin and Minnesota are looking for ways to exercise these new rights with their states. Yeah.
Is there any projections about when it's gonna happen where, okay, no more watering your lawn? That seems like a first one that's gonna go.
Yeah, actually.
All the other things seem more.
It's interesting, when we were looking through all the municipal ordinances and statutes, that's the only thing we could find that protected groundwater was lawn watering bans. And it's like, even and odd, and only in a drought. And so, yeah, that is what we are seeing, but then in the same areas, you'll see a homeowners association require a certain kind of landscaping and lawns and irrigation systems. So, yeah, I don't think that's going away anytime soon, sadly. Yes?
Corollary to that, is there any chance of different municipalities starting to pass laws that would overwrite and supersede the homeowner association, things like that? And particularly in terms of not only the lawn watering, but also allowing and encouraging more, native grasses and pollinator friendly things like that. The HOAs sometimes frown on. Have they started working on that for both water and plant?
I think you can see that, I appreciate the question, I think you can see that happening in certain areas that are stressed. You've all heard of the White Bear Lake case, where the cities around it were pumping a lot of water. Potentially that was the charge, and that was drawing down White Bear Lake levels. And independent parties sued the Department of Natural Resources for permitting all of those cities to take that much water. That's still in court, actually. But that area was designated by the DNR as a groundwater management area. And they have a handful of those groundwater management areas across the state. They don't exert much authority in those areas, but they provide a lot of data to the stakeholders, the communities involved. They convene them frequently. They try to move them towards a decision of shared water, but they haven't come in with a hammer in most cases. There's one exception where, I always forget what this river is called. It's kind of western Sherburne County. It was impacting Cold Spring. Anybody know the river I'm talking about? Little Rock Creek. Little Rock Creek, irrigated sand plain with corn and soybeans right up to the edge of it, and it's also a beer bottling operation there. And the DNR looks like they might be shutting off some irrigation wells there to try to get the stream to bounce back a little bit. But it was another groundwater management area. So I think in the White Bear Lake example, I participated in these Net Council groundwater conversations across the regions. That northeast area that includes, Woodbury and White Bear Lake, they have a lot of groundwater challenges. They are thinking proactively at the community level. But the most they can do is kind of provide incentives to do things differently. Ordinances would help.
I'm just thinking if they could supersede
Yeah.
HOA, demanding X irrigation, so they say, no, we want max the irrigation of this.
Yeah, and I don't know the politics of homeowners associations. Anybody in one? Do they make you do certain things?
They're lazy.
You're allowed to hear, okay. Yeah.
So, and we don't have irrigation.
I didn't know that they were.
However, I know people who are in ones where there's much more control.
Yeah.
But they control the vegetation around your house. And the implications of that.
Yeah, so again, this can be a hyper-local issue. It can be solved locally.
Where does irrigation fit in the hierarchy of needs?
Of uses,
Yeah.
I think it is like third. I think energy production is second. I should know this. This is in statute. So it's domestic energy production and then I think irrigated agriculture.
By energy production, you're talking about hydroelectric
Yeah,
operation.
and cooling that you need, like for nuclear power and things like that, yeah.
I'm just wondering if there have always been concerns about having enough groundwater, or if this is a new concern because of either population growth or climate change or more connected interstate industry. Is it a new situation, or we're just starting to talk about it?
So the question is whether this is a new concern or we're just starting to talk about it. Are there certain conditions that led to this concern about groundwater? It certainly it was talked about in Minnesota. Twin Cities got off of groundwater and are drinking Mississippi River water because of concern over groundwater depletion. So most major metropolitan areas in this region are using surface water for their drinking water source because groundwater is not sustainable. As the suburbs grow, they all drill wells because that's cheaper, it's easier to treat and make it drinkable, and you're farther potentially from those rivers and lakes that would provide drinking water sources. But I think it's true that surface water is the most sustainable source for drinking. You might argue with me on the Red River because they go kind of feast and famine up there. They have significant drought, but they also are in a very thick section of clay with very limited groundwater resources. So I would say that it's a conversation that it started happening in these states at different times. It was always driven by a drought and some kind of a crisis condition. Most industries are looking at the Great Lakes as their future for water. So California dairies are coming here and, because they see this as supply that is greater. And if it's well sited, then it might be appropriate to put water intensive industries here. If it's well sited, the water's reused multiple times or recharged to the ground. But we're trying now to have conversations with DEED, our Department of Employment and Economic Development, and they're saying to businesses, come here, put your server farm down in Rosemont. And also look at Farmington for your next data center, and your chip manufacturers should go into parts of Indiana that, are water rich. But we want to have conversations, we want DEED to have conversations with the DNR early in the planning process so that they're not citing water intensive industry out in this part of the state where there is no groundwater except for small glacial aquifers. Or even big dairies, big confined animal feed operations have tried to go into Traverse County, Wilkin County, and those counties are putting moratoriums on those uses because they don't have enough water for their people. So they don't want to see, cows and pigs taking it all.
A few years ago, we took a field trip down to the southwest corner of the state where there was rural water.
Yeah.
And that was a new concept to me. And I was traveling in Iowa last week and I came across a rural water supply.
Mm-hmm.
Want to talk about
Sure.
where we have rural water and the implications there?
Yeah, so that part, do I have that? Let me get that geologic map again. So, hold on my mouse. So rural water is it's your municipal water supply in places where it's really hard for you to have an individual private well. So all of the white part of Minnesota, it's hard to have an individual private well that has either the quality or the quantity of water you need. Especially in the southwestern part of the state, the groundwater that is there is really high in sulfate. which is a laxative. And it will kill baby animals. So if you're growing pigs or something, you don't want high sulfate water, and you probably don't want it as a person either. And there's other things dissolved in the water. Their surface sand, they do have some of those glacial aquifers at the surface. Let me find that map. But they do a lot of agriculture out there, and these are all really high nitrate surface water sources now. And so an individual can't treat for nitrate. The cities aren't big enough, or maybe they don't have aquifers located where the cities are. So rural water systems like Lincoln Pipestone Rural Water, Red Rock Rural Water, there are others. There's at least 3 or 4 being planned. They're your regional water provider. They have a well field and a lot of pipes. And they go out to these farms and they supply water to them instead of them using a domestic well on site. And so they treat the water also.
That's one of the places where the conversation came up there, importing water from
Missouri River watershed. So this part of the state, which is in the Missouri River watershed, those ones that are draining in that direction, they import water through the Lewis and Clark pipeline system into Laverne. Like, that's one of the towns, but they can't go to Marshall, because that's on the other side of the divide. It's in the Mississippi River watershed. So they have to use it and discharge it on the Missouri side of the watershed. Yeah. And part of that's invasive species control and things, but this is not great water. It's shallow. It's a well field that goes under the Missouri River through the sand, kind of sucking Missouri River water that's just been filtered a little bit by the sand in the valley. And then it's putting it in a pipe and taking that to southwest Minnesota. And the other one that's being discussed right now is up in the Red River Valley to bring water in from North Dakota. I just saw that plan recently.
Is there an estimate for the total volume of groundwater in Minnesota? And if there is, how does it compare to the total volume of surface water, total volume of Lake Superior, or whatever?
That's such a good question, and there isn't. That's one of the problems. We don't know how much is down there.
Oh.
Some people say in Michigan there's as much water under Michigan as in Lake Michigan. I don't know how to evaluate that. You know, we can estimate the water-bearing layers, and I suppose we can estimate the porosity of those layers, at least for the bedrock, but the glacial is really, really hard. And then, you know, it's moving slowly. We can kind of estimate the ages of water. Somebody who had to leave asked me, do we know how old it is? And yeah, kind of. Some is quite old, 10,000 years old. You know, still has the characteristics of glacial meltwater. It's a very hard question, and I've never seen someone try to put a number on it. But it's generally preferred over surface water because it's quicker to get at, requires less treatment than surface water, and you kind of, it's a known quantity. Like if you're a brewer, you want to keep taking the groundwater because you know it's going to be the same. Surface water varies quite a bit with season and.
Well, as a general rule, the Minneapolis or the state of Minnesota is water rich compared to a lot of the states.
Absolutely, yeah, and water rich and also really far ahead in this region for looking into issues of knowledge production and groundwater governance. So we are looked to by the rest of the region who's paying attention. Illinois might not be paying attention, but we're looked to, and in fact, at the groundwater conference that the Minnesota Groundwater Association is hosting, we're going to have Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin coming and talking about their groundwater challenges, and we invited them to come, so they're going to come, and we're also going to keep them for another day and host them at the DNR so that they can just share best practices with their peers. This is the way we feel empowered to kind of grow a system of governance with the help of the Joyce Foundation. And I was going to mention, because you asked it in the break, how we're talking to Canada about this. The funder has a good megaphone. Joyce Foundation is a very reputable funder. And she just got me a speaking gig in front of the legislatures from those states, at least representatives from their environmental caucus, and the provinces. So on December 10th, I'll be talking to that whole group about this topic. So I've got your questions are good. They're helping me realize where I need to tighten this up a little.
You're welcome.
So, it's their goal in the next 10 years to advance groundwater governance in the region. So don't feel overwhelmed. You might have been hearing about this for the first time, but there are people thinking about this, and we're making progress, really good progress.
One or two more questions then?
So ILSG doesn't connect in with this?
Institute on Lake Superior Geology, they're all those hard rock guys with just fractures. And they don't think about groundwater much, I don't think. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a common price for water, or who sets the price? Per gallon or per
Yeah. The
whatever?
price per water set by the municipality, and they usually do it to fund their waterworks. And it's a really hard thing to price because you don't, some of them have like ranking schemes, like if you're a good conservationist, you might get a better price. But then that encourages you to use more, it's a hard thing to price, but I think we can say it's not priced at what it's worth. It's not. Back there?
You seem to talk about Native American tribes as if they were just one single thing in all of your planning. Is that true, or is their governments as come?
Very different. We talked to 25 of those 35 tribal nations. We had 5 in the room just last week, and they do think about water differently. They do have different governance, different DNRs, different water systems. I think that what's common about them is they see water as sacred and vital to life. They see water as one system. They haven't been thinking about groundwater separately from surface water, but the specific concerns they have vary quite a bit. Like Lac de Flambeau told us about a story where they grow cranberries in that region, and cranberries they manipulate water levels to harvest them, but also, I didn't realize, to protect them from frost. And so they have these high capacity wells to flood the fields if they think they're going to get a frost. And that happens at precisely the time the tribes are hatching fish, or their fish have spawned and put eggs in the shallow areas of their lakes, and when the eggs are most vulnerable. And in some cases, the water level in the lakes lowers by 2 feet. And so it exposes those spawning beds at a critical time. So that's something we didn't know. And I don't know if that's unique to Lac de Flambeau with that group, but we heard different things like White Earth is very concerned about potato growers in the region around White Earth and the Straight River watershed. They tried to institute well permitting system to keep RDOF from drilling high capacity wells within 2 miles of the reservation. That went to federal court and then they withdrew it. Red Lake seems to be kind of autonomous. They probably are more worried about climate impacts on the Red Lake peatlands. I haven't heard much concern about water use around them. Upper Sioux no longer lets the State Geological Survey map in their area, kick the USGS off. Lower Sioux is the one that had that incident with Redwood County allowing manure spreading. Everyone has a different issue. Fond du Lac has a very good groundwater and surface water department, environmental department, and they're leading the way in some of these initiatives with EPA giving more authority to the tribes. So yeah, all different. And we have, 4 Dakota and then 7 Anishinaabe or Ojibwa bands in the north, and there's more different types of tribes as you go east. Yeah.
Have they started to have the same conversations in Canada with the First Nations folks there? Because I would think that this would be the thing that's going to start as we spread these agreements internationally, that we're going to wind up with a 4-way.
And I don't know, I can't answer that question, but that's a good thing to look into. Thank you. Someone over there?
Go ahead.
Right here.
It's probably not even related, but, and we're a long ways from the oceans, but desalinization, is there any benchmark price point? Why don't we bottled water places go to the ocean.
That's a good point.
Desalinate.
Yeah, that point was brought up during this workshop last week. Why don't the coastal communities just do that? Seems like you could use solar energy even to do it, so I don't know.
Part of the problem is you've got to get rid of the salt. You've got a lot of chemicals that are being withdrawn from that water, and what do you do with it?
Well, sea salt, you put it in your.
I should let you all go.
No, I got one.
Okay, one more.
Talk a little bit about agricultural tiling.
And tiling is an interesting one because tiling kind of permanently lowers the water table to where those perforated pipes are. So takes you down 4 feet or so. And then that water, instead of that amount of water, the head is what we call it, instead of that head soaking into the ground, it goes off sideways into the ditch and out, you know. So people make arguments that we're diverting water that would recharge the aquifers by tiling. And I don't think anyone's been able to demonstrate that by, I mean, if you think about what it would take to demonstrate that tile water is diverting groundwater recharge, you'd have to have a case study where you had some monitoring wells that were only impacted by tile, not any kind of pumping. Or you'd have to account for the pumping that's happened, and I don't think anyone knows how to do that. And if you think about it just being, you just lowered the head by 4 feet, it doesn't sound as dire as you're diverting all this rainwater that could be recharging. Because you are still recharging from below that, the tile. So I don't have a good answer for that. It's a huge surface water problem. I hate drain tile, but I can't make a groundwater argument against it right now.
Let's thank Carrie. And
Thank you.